All right, so we're waiting a couple more minutes. I just wanted to, as we were waiting, um, there's a question I want y'all to think about, and then we'll talk about it once we get started. But thinking about the types of multiple choice questions that you think students detest. I didn't say hate, but it's kind of the same thing, detest. Or even if you remember from your graduate school, undergrad days, which ones did you not like having on exams? And we'll get started in just a minute or so. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm glad y'all are here. This is one of my favorite webinars to give because it's one of those I wish I had known this, and I'm still still reminding myself of these rules of writing good multiple choice questions. I appreciate all of you being here. I'm just to introduce myself, I'm the Dr. Michelle Hardy. I'm the program manager for TA training at the CTE. I am also an instructor in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. I've been an instructor for going on now 25 years. I cannot believe it's been that long. And looking back on my time, I've made so many mistakes. So my job is here to help you not make the mistakes that I did. So I do want to hear from y'all. Go ahead and post in the chat, or you can pipe up, on your microphone. What are some of those types of questions that you think you're it's awesome. Kelly's is the best. So that you think your students really detest. Yeah, both A and B, both B and C. A, B, C, D, A, and B, except F. Yeah, where you can lose points. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think when you have such complex questions, students really do get stressed out because they're afraid that they're not catching something, that it's a trick. And I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the rules for these trivia questions. Yeah, that's a good point. And I tell this to my students when they ask what my exams are like. And I say, look, if it's something that you can Google, it's probably something that is not as important, that should be on the exam, as things about thinking questions and putting things together and extrapolating. Options that are too similar or tough to decipher. So what we're going to talk about is all of these things that y'all have just mentioned here. What is it about exam questions that are tough for students to be able to double negatives, triple negatives? Yes, I talk about that one. Things that students just really stress over, that you're then stressing them out on something that all you're wanting to do is see what they learned and make sure that they learned what you were hoping they were with respect to the learning outcomes. Example-based questions. So yeah, they'll try and Chase, that's a really good point, that they're used to having to study and regurgitate information, and then when you give them the critical thinking types of questions, that stresses them out too. So going forward from that, what I often tell students is, it's good to have that background knowledge, but what I want you to do with that knowledge is to show me what you've learned and how well you've learned it and made those connections. And so we'll look at that. And I think that's a question that I get from a lot of people whenever I do this webinar is, how do I use multiple choice questions to actually do higher level critical thinking types of questions? And I'm going to show you that there are ways, and you can definitely do that. So what we'll be exploring is qualities of good test questions, and then we're actually going to go into the design of what a multiple question should look like, multiple choice questions should look like when you're designing the actual question with respect to both the question and then the answers that you give. So we're going to do that with examples, and then at the very end we're going to do a little test, a multiple choice test, to see how well you learned what you're supposed to have gotten out of today. Of course, you will have a cheat sheet, of course. So what we're wanting to assess, basically thinking about when you write an exam, what's the purpose of it when you're writing these multiple choice questions? And I'm looking at what Dr. Catropo wrote. He says they use ExamSoft at the School of Medicine. Oh, where you can't use all the above, none of the above. That's very interesting. Yes. Oh, how interesting. I did not know that about ExamSoft. Well, that's very good to know. When you're trying to assess something on an exam, you always want to make sure that the questions that you write go back to the learning outcomes of the course. Like one of y'all mentioned trivia. Is that really what you wanted your students to get out of the course? Like, this is not a class training them for Jeopardy, essentially. So you want to make sure that it's going back to what the goals are of your course. Are these skills, abilities, connections, higher level thinking, not just level of knowledge, but content, mastery, of course, but mastery is more than memorization. I think y'all would all agree with me on that. That extent of knowledge goes towards more than just reiterating or regurgitating, but also making those links, application, understanding, depth of understanding. And so using that knowledge, how can it be used and applied in those example types of questions? That's what they're going to see in real life. And that's what I tell my students, is that I'm going to give you questions that you have the knowledge to answer them. Now what you're going to do is see how well you're able to use that knowledge. Also, your questions can both assess competency, or they can even assess progress through the course, depending on what your course is actually the learning outcomes are about. So how well they know information versus how well they're growing. And that depends on the course, and it depends on your design of the course as well. And then, things such as convergent thinking versus divergent thinking. Do you want them to extrapolate, or do you want them to come to a conclusion? All of these things can be done with multiple choice questions. It all depends on how you craft the question. And we all know, y'all wouldn't be here if you didn't already know that writing multiple choice questions, good ones, is hard. And so I'm going to help you guys with how to do that, make them better, make it easier for you as well. So the qualities of a good question and the test in general. First of all, it lets students show what they have learned. So you don't want an exam question or the exam itself to be so hard that even though a student studied, they're not able to show you what they do know. And so that gets to the idea of where you want your exam to have a wide variety of different levels of questions. From when we go back and look at Bloom's, and I'm going to briefly touch on this in a second, you have knowledge, you have application, you have remembering, maybe some evaluation, but you're just going across the whole gamut of them being able to show you what they know. It has to have high validity, or it should, where it's actually asking questions that get to what it is that you actually want to evaluate. And so one of the things that that helps for you to design questions that do this is using the Bloom's taxonomy, because that gets at that level of thinking that you're really wanting to see in the students. As we just talked about, it's versatile, tests multiple levels of knowledge, not just of the cognitive thinking, but different types of knowledge, metacognitive knowledge, procedural knowledge. There's different types of knowledge that you might be trying to test for. And multiple choice questions can do that based on how you design them. But also has realistic expectations. And this goes back to mentioning where the test is so hard that, all the students struggle, where the final exam, or the exam average was a 40 or a 50. That is not necessarily, that tells you a lot. When you have an exam average that is that low, there's more going on than just students maybe not studying. Perhaps what they learned or how they learned it, they're not studying the way they need to for that course. Perhaps you're not teaching at the level that they need. They don't have the background knowledge that they need. There's all sorts of things that can be going on. But it's still challenging, but it still matches your average expected student ability level. And then it's free of bias. And this has, I think, really fortunately become so much more important, or at least more understandable as to how important this is, about making sure that when you ask questions, what is in the question and the things that they use, say if you use examples or case studies, it's something that students have had experience with or can visualize, and that it doesn't make the exam question harder because they don't have any experience with it. And one of the really good examples that I like to talk about with this is whenever I teach marine science, I talk about coastlines, and I was talking about how the different islands along the South Carolina coast, barrier islands and stuff, and I was was naming all these names. And I had a student raise her hand and said, I've never been to the coast. And so that showed me I was making these assumptions that I shouldn't have. And so here I thought I was giving such a great illustration of what Barrier Islands look like with South Carolina coastline, and someone had never even been to the coast in the first place. So you want to think about when you write those examples, making sure that the background in that example is accessible to all, is inclusive, and that is a very important thing to consider. When you're writing good multiple choice questions that are fair, but are also challenging, you want to, first of all, use Bloom's. And those of you who have been in many of my or some of my webinars, you know I'm a fan of Bloom's. Bloom's taxonomy is a guide for you to help you write good questions based on the level of cognitive thinking that you want to be addressed in your students. And so y'all have this in your handout. I'm going to show y'all your handout here. So the first page of your handout has this image as well as another one, which I'll get to in a second. But what this does is this shows you if you want to write a question, if you want to write a question that gets to, basic understanding, these are the verbs that you use as the verb in the sentence, what we call the sentence stem, to get at that level. Same with applying, analyzing, and those of you who have worked with Bloom's know that some of these verbs can go into different levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, but it all depends on what the rest of the question asks. So it's kind of context dependent, which is great because that means you can kind of address different levels of thinking even within the same question, depending on how you ask the question. So always go back to Bloom's when you're trying to figure out what type of level of thinking you want, so that it's not all just level 1 and level 2, go back to Bloom's. I also gave you in that packet some action words, just a nice description of the different levels of Bloom's with all the verbs in them. I have this, I use this all the time, I kid you not. I go back and whenever I'm trying to make sure that I'm writing a question, at the analyze level, well, do any of my questions have that verb in it? And that's one thing you can do is you can go back and look and kind of grade yourself, looking at the verbs, seeing which ones fall into those 6 levels. Do you have it all weighted to, level 1 and 2, or is it all weighted to level 5 and 6? You need to have more of a breadth there. And that's called test item analysis. That's a neat way to be able to analyze how broadly encompassing of cognitive thinking strategy or thinking skills your exam actually has. This other Bloom's taxonomy diagram that I wanted to show you gets at what I mentioned where, yes, you have those 6 levels of cognitive process, but you also have different types of knowledge. So you're looking at, am I testing procedural knowledge, conceptual knowledge, factual knowledge, and then what level of that thinking am I testing on? And so there are different verbs get at both the cognitive dimension and the knowledge dimension. And so good questions, you are able to figure out which one of these are being tested, and you can make sure that you're addressing the entire range that your goal is for that particular exam. Are there questions on that so far? I know that that's a very brief overview of Bloom's. For those of you who might not have seen it, I could wax forever on Bloom's, but I'm not going to. That's not what this is about. But I'm happy to answer other questions about that. Okay, yeah, I do too. I think it's just a really neat visualization of that. And this is from Iowa State University, by the way. And they have an interactive website with that. Thank you, Anne. So how do we do multiple choice questions that address higher level? And so Adriana asked how exactly this taxonomy is clear for students. Do you think that each verb makes sense to us in the same way for students? And so that is a really good question. That gets back to the context of the question. And so when you say you use a verb such as, say we go into apply, they may not realize that when you ask them to sketch something or to demonstrate something, you're actually having them do that level of thinking. But then it also depends on what you're having them sketch or what you're having them do a demonstration of, if it's just a regurgitation of an experiment, or demonstrate how two things relate to each other. Again, it depends on the context of the question. And I don't know that, I know some people do talk about Bloom's in their classes when they have students recognize how important it is to know the different levels, and that might be something that you can actually do. So I don't know if that answered your question, Adriana. Yes, so Chase, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you can do the higher level thinking skills. And I can understand with Create, now not necessarily with, I think with Create it would be difficult to do higher level multiple choice, but what you can do for the middle upper range of Bloom's is use things called what we call Memory Plus application questions, where they're having to do the recall and the understanding and the analysis in their head in order to then come to a final answer that then is the multiple choice question answers that they choose from. So things like applying principles, doing problem solving, this goes back to those examples, interpretation of causes and effects. There's so much you have to pull on when you do those types of questions that you're really pulling on all the various different levels of thinking. Analyzing patterns, this is a great example of when you're doing Bloom's and you go back to the evaluate. Evaluate can be analyzing patterns as well. It can be both evaluate and analyze, depending on what it is you're having them analyze, the patterns, relationships, that sort of thing. Justifying methods is also an evaluation. You're evaluating what you have. Now, why are you using this method? Say you have a case study of social work or something, and why do you use this procedure or this model for this case study? Justify it, and so that is an upper level. And that would be something that you would then give them options of what's the best justification of why you use this particular case study or that particular model. So the key to doing multiple choice, higher level thinking questions is placing the concept in some context where students have to pull from multiple parts of their memory, of their understanding, of their application. So let me show you some examples. Would you mind if I said how I use this to organize a test? Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
So when I did this more explicitly when I was a middle school and high school teacher, but I would write the test at the beginning of the unit and decide what things were so important that they needed to be recall questions, low on Bloom's taxonomy, and those things appeared on the test because they were critical for student understanding. And then for middle school and high school level tests, a fewer number of the mid-range of Bloom's, and then the upper range of Bloom's, the synthesize. There were fewer of those questions, and depending on the level of class, they may have counted for more or less. But when we were in the learning progress, I would give practice questions and point out, this is, I'm just looking for a definition here, or this is a question where you have to think through and put 3 pieces of information together so students could see what that synthesis looked like in a multiple choice question, because it is different than a lot of questions that they see.
Yep. And something else that I have done similar to that is I have helped step them through that synthesis process where they have 2 sets of questions, one where it takes them step by step through the thinking process, and then the next question that's worth more because it actually has them do all of that within a single question to get at the final answer. So you're actually both, first of all, modeling how to do it and then assessing their ability to do it on their own as well. And I have them do these as practice questions before I, just like Georgina said, before I actually give the exam. Otherwise it stresses them out.
It can seem tedious, and like as an instructor, I'm wasting my valuable instruction time. But as the semester goes on, it takes less and less time for students to recognize what I'm expecting of them in a complex multiple choice question.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because they start understanding what they're going to be doing and what is expected of them. That's awesome. Here's an example. So testing higher order thinking, this is something that I really don't understand much. It's been a time since I've had cell biology and biochemistry. But what you see is that you see this plot talking about proteins and signal peptides, and then what it says, based on this information, what kind of protein do you think this particular sequence is? And so they're having to pull multiple parts of understanding into being able to actually answer that. And so things that have graphs that have, they have to interpret things, whether it's, you know, a graph or a plot or a table, that then has them applying their knowledge to a situation, a real situation. And you don't necessarily have to be in sciences. You can do this with all of the different disciplines. Here's one for medicine or social work, where you're giving a basically students have to be able to apply their logical thinking process to discriminate between which answers are better than others. And some people may say, well, I thought that you didn't want, because you'll see in a second where you want the question's answers to be distinctly different from each other. But in this case, this higher order thinking question, that's part of the process that they're going to experience in their job in real life, is making these types of discriminations. And so you, with the experience that you already have, know those. You have experienced those yourself. And so you can provide those as example case study types of questions for them to do that higher level discrimination. Here's another one. This is physics, looking at lenses and how lenses focus light. So this is a typical diagram of how light rays pass through a lens and converge at a focus. How do you then make those rays parallel again? And so when you, if you put a lens here, what would you do at point B or point C or point A in order to make those rays parallel? And so they're having to apply multiple levels of thinking, remembering, understanding principles in order to answer this question. And here's one with poetry. So say there's a poem here. You're analyzing and identifying patterns and relationships. So in this case, the chief purpose of stanza 9. I remember when I was in high school, gosh, it was a long time ago, I did literary criticism, and it was all multiple choice questions. So they had, you know, passages from an article that you were supposed to read or a book, and you had to analyze it based on your understanding and your knowledge of literary criticism. So you can do higher level thinking in any discipline, and it all depends on how you ask the question and the context of the answer options that you give them. And I'll show you what I mean by this in a second, where you're testing different things about it. Maybe you're testing understanding or being able to really discern different things. It all depends on how you write the question. Okay. So I want to mention that students know how to game the system. So if you were to go and ask, you know, Google how to outsmart a test or cheat on a test, you will get millions of hits. There are websites out there that say, here are 4 ways to outsmart any multiple choice test. And this is what that website said. Read the choices, eliminate those that make no sense with the others, and you can probably narrow down the choices to 2. Well, that's not what you're testing, is it? It's your ability to guess really well. And so what you want to do with how you craft the questions is eliminate this ability for students to do well just on their skill at test taking. So this goes back to then, how do I write good questions, not just the question itself, but the answer options that they're given. Yeah, sure, go ahead, Georgina. And by the way, Georgina is CTE's graduate student. She helps us in the CTE, so go ahead.
Oh, I already did. I just,
oh, okay.
This was interesting. I didn't believe this was true. And then I was taking a multiple choice test in a 500 level class. And 90% of the questions, the longest answer, because when you write the correct answer, you add caveats. So it's always the correct answer.
And that's actually one of the subheadings of one of the rules, because I discovered I do the same thing. Exactly the same thing. So in the beginning, when you're writing those exams, you use the Bloom's taxonomy. Also make sure you write good exam instructions. And I think that's really important to go back and make sure that it is absolutely clear what students are doing in the different sections of the exam. Very explicit. There's enough information for students to be able to answer the questions, very clear. And then make sure you kind of assess how long that exam is going to be. So I used this semester I had that problem. So I taught Geology 103 last spring, but I had it as a hour 15-minute class. And this semester, oh yeah, absolutely. So in this semester I have it as a 50-minute class. And so I thought, oh, I'll just take out about 3 or 4 questions and it'll be fine. No, it was not. So you want to assume that, first of all, students read slowly, and they take their time going through the different questions, those who really want to make sure they're doing well, and assume at least 2 minutes plus per question. So for a 50-minute time period for an exam, that's 25 questions. That's not a lot. And so if it's multiple choice. And so what I then do is I take that and maybe do, yeah, I totally agree, Kelly. So you want them to be able to have time to go back and double check. So then if it was 25 multiple choice, maybe I'll do 20 multiple choice and then 2 or 3, maybe 1 or 2 short answer, or a matching or something like that if I have a really large class. So you really need to think about how long this is going to take. Of course, when you write the key, it takes you less than 10 minutes, but that's you, so not your students. And then thinking about how you score students' work. And it's amazing how I didn't think of this before, but you can have multiple choice questions be worth more than others. Say you have a 2-part question or one that builds on itself, where the first part of the question, the first multiple choice, is maybe 2 points. The next one that's building on that is 3 points. And so this is, again, is something that don't let what you think has to be done restrict you in how you can improve your exam. And then, yeah, so teaching online is giving them enough time to complete without giving them too much so they can look at the answers. And that's true. And so I think that the 2-minute is a good thing to shoot for. But yeah, you're right, Stephanie, that's a good point. Yeah, and respond as lockdown, if you use that can help you as well. I've not actually used that, so I can't advise on that, but others I know have. So let's look at the rules for question development. So there are quite a few. So as y'all have already talked about, these are some bad ways to ask questions. So there are some very consistent rules that you can use. And so I've given you, in your handout, there is a summary of these rules, and I'm going to be going through them in turn. So first of all, know that multiple choice questions have 2 parts. They have the STEM, which is the question, the problem, and then they have what are called alternatives. So these are the 4 alternatives that you choose from. One is the answer, and the others are called distractors. And I love the term that they're called distractors, because good multiple choice questions, especially for your majors that you really want to make sure they know how to discern differences, the distractors can be part of the learning itself, where they have to recognize that is not a good choice because of this. And so they're really pulling on different aspects of their learning. So you have an answer, and you have your distractors, and you have the STEM. Oh, that's interesting, 1.5 minutes per question, and you abide by that. That's good to hear. That's very good to hear. All right, so the first rule for the STEM. The STEM should be meaningful by itself. I still find myself breaking this and having to go back and fix it, where you have a single idea or problem that focuses on achievement of a particular learning outcome, or an aspect of a learning outcome. And so for all of these rules, I'm going to give y'all examples, because of course we love examples to see what it is that we're trying to understand here. So here's a really bad STEM. Which of the following, how many times do I do that? Which of the following is a true statement? Well, the problem is that the STEM needs to talk about what the content of the question is. So it needs to be specific to that question, because then your answers, your actual distractors and your answers are really long and complex. So the more specific you make your STEM, the more specific your answers and your distractors can be. So here now, the better STEM is actually addressing the mitochondrial genomes issue, and then students can then discern between that the one that is the true answer, instead of what, and you'll see this in a second, how good their reading comprehension is. You're not testing reading comprehension, maybe, some of y'all might, but you're testing being able to understand these particular concepts, what your learning outcome is. So STEM should be meaningful. The STEM should be clear. So the question should have one and only one best answer. And is it stated clearly so that students understand that it's only asking for a particular answer? And is the problem described fully? So there's a couple different things where in your STEM, especially if you're doing a question that has different, parts to students developing the answer or determining the answer, making sure they have everything they need to know in order to answer the question. This gets to the whole, I remember whenever I was in undergrad and grad school where there were often things thrown in there to trick me up or trick students up and see if they could discern between things that were important and not important. And I have different feelings about that. I understand why that was done, but as a student, I didn't understand that, and it just frustrated me. So I think what would have been better was that the faculty member could have said, you're going to be getting all this information. So say you're testing ocean characteristics, salinity and temperature and stuff. You need to be able to learn how to discern what is the important stuff in order to answer the question. If I had been told that, then I'd be like, okay, I get that. I understand why you're giving me all this extra stuff. So here's some examples of clarity. For example, California. Well, what are we testing about California? So, all these specific little details. Better example, what was the main reason people moved to California? So you're testing a specific outcome, a learning outcome of, population and geography, that type of thing. So that's what you're trying to get at. So being very clear in what the STEM is trying to test the student on. Here's another example. I love this one. Suppose you're a mathematics professor, blah, 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 blah. You decide to analyze blah, 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 blah. Which of the following t-tests is appropriate? And I can tell you I've probably done this many times where you're trying to be, lighthearted. Oh, pretend this happens. Well, that's a lot of word fluff that doesn't really need to be there. You can do the same thing with this better example, saying when analyzing your students' pre and post tests, which statistic tests do you use? And that still gets to the thinking that you want, the learning that you have been wanting them to do, and still giving you that students that broader background of why you would actually ask this question or why you would use these different statistics for a t-test. That's why I think we can all say guilty, Kelly, for sure. Using positive phrasing. So this goes both to the STEM and to the alternatives and the answer. So trying to avoid the absolutes. And I still catch myself doing these. Never, always, only, because those are like, I'm using this word, so that means any other possibility has to be wrong except in this very specific situation. So that's a key word that students learn to key into, that often either this is not the right answer or it is the right answer. And students can overlook that term. They don't catch that. And so if I do have to use these types of words, I always both underline and bold it to make sure that students don't miss that word. This goes back to negative phrasing. Sometimes it's hard for students to understand, especially if it's a wordy sentence. If you have negative phrasing or if it's a double negative, try not to do that because you have to really parse what you're trying to say in the sentence, in the question, and making sure you understand what the question is asking, because often then the distractors are if you didn't read the question correctly. And again, we're not trying to test reading comprehension so much, depending again on the topic, as we are discerning content knowledge and understanding. So here's another example. This is what I do. If I say, and of course it says which of the following. Which of the following is not an example, of whatever it might be. And then again, trying to avoid negative phrasing unless the learning outcome is part of that. So here's an example. Which of the following is not true about mitochondria? You know, they contain DNA, blah, blah, blah. All of the following true about mitochondria except. And so really, you can do either of these, but the better one, and this isn't a mitochondria one, is, but this is one where it shows that you have this extinguisher putting out, burning all of the following except what. And so you're not using negative phrasing, you're being specific as to what you're trying to see that they can distinguish between. And so that's a better way of using negative phrasing without actually using negative terminology. And again, these are things you have to go back and look for, but now that y'all know what to look for, it'll be a lot easier. The stem should be a question, not a partial sentence. I catch myself doing this all the time. And this way, students will then have a question in their mind instead of some section where they have to then go back and read the section again and fill in the word for the next one. Read the section and fill in the word. So like I said, I do this, I have to catch myself and not do this. So interior blanks is not a full sentence, it's a partial sentence. So here's a better way of writing it. Instead of, in addition to the nucleus blank or organelles, now we say which organelles contain DNA. And so it's a much easier sentence to understand that then tests their understanding. Oh yeah, so that's a really good point. So covering up the options, see if you can know what the answer would be, and if not, if you can't figure it out, your students can't either, and go back to the drawing. Yeah, so that's really cool. So the negatives are verboten by the NBME. That's awesome. That's so good that they have those guidelines for y'all. Awesome. All right, so let's look at the distractors. And so this, I love this meme or this whatever it is. Me doing the exam, okay, the answer for 13 is A. Why do I start seeing this pattern? Next one, okay, is A. And then I have heard of instructors and graduate students making patterns on like a bubble sheet to get students to be, doubt their answers. And I'm just like, that's not part of learning. You know, don't do that. I also do, whenever I do an exam, I go back and look at my answer and make sure there's not like a string of 6 B's or 6 C's, because students will question, well, that's not, you know, that's not random. There's a reason I must have done something wrong. So I do go back and check my pattern to make sure there's not a pattern or a string of stuff like that. All right, so for your distractors, use plausible distractors, ones that are actually useful for discrimination between the different answers. Again, the distractors are your wrong responses. So when students, and the reason why you want to use good distractors is that when students who did study well, they'll understand that those are not the right answer and they'll choose the right one anyway. Those who did not study well, if it's a plausible distractor, then that's showing that they didn't understand the content. And so you're not getting them, they're not answering the correct answer by just good guessing, essentially. You actually know the students didn't get this because that's information you need, whether or not they got that content or not. So here's a good example. Who gathered the data that helped reveal DNA? Snoopy, George Washington. Well, those are 2 that you can immediately cross off, you know, and now I have a 33% chance of getting the answer right. So writing options so that they are homogeneous in content. So this is what Georgina was talking about. So the one that is really off, and actually this is a little bit different from hers, we'll get to hers in a second, but the one that is really clearly an outlier either is the cue that is the right one or a cue that is absolutely not the correct one. So here's a good example. Ways that membranes are able to remain fluid when it's cold, you know, increasing cholesterol, unsaturated phospholipids, fatty acids and phospholipids, saturated phospholipids. Well, there's one that doesn't talk about phospholipids. So either that's the right one or that's definitely the wrong one. So you want to make sure that you are being specific with your distractors to make sure that they are realistic and homogeneous with the answer too, essentially. Stating your alternatives clearly and concisely. That way you're, as I talked about before, you're not doing reading comprehension. So this goes both for the STEM and the distractors. So here's a great example. I have done these before myself. The term hypothesis is defined as, holy crap. So you're basically reading 3 different questions in the answers themselves. So a better alternative, much better, is this. So here was that example I just showed you, the poor example. Here's a much better one where you are just being very specific and explicit and clear and concise with the actual answers, or with the distractors and the actual answer. This is a lot of verbiage that you can kind of really whittle down. And it makes that then also helps to ensure that students aren't spending 5 minutes on one question. That really helps that a lot with that. Alternatives should be mutually exclusive. Surprisingly, this one I think can be more common than others. It depends on, of course, what your questions are about. But example here, how long does an annual plant live? Well, it lives for many years. It also lives for more than 1 year, so it could be multiple answers here. And so what students can then do is they'll actually find the incorrect answer without knowing which one was actually correct, because it could have been either of those. I don't know which one, but one of them has to be correct because one of them is correct. And some students think that those can be trick questions, and students don't like trick questions. It really does, like it says here, erode their trust in you're being a fair professor and fair in asking the questions and assessing their knowledge. Presents alternatives in a, distractors present alternatives in a logical order. You should do this, whether it's alphabetical, numerical, and this is something that I tend to try to do, but I don't always. It depends on what the distractors are, what the question is asking. I'll show you an example so you understand what I'm saying. But what you often see is that if you often go and put your answer in B, this helps to prevent that from happening. And you don't always catch yourself doing that. Again, that's why I always go back and double check my answer series to see what my pattern is. So here's an example, putting them in alphabetical order: active, exocytosis, facilitated, phagocytosis, simple diffusion, basically. If it's short terms like this, alphabetical is good. If it's longer phrases, then I actually don't do alphabetical. Yeah, it is, and it helps, like I said, more randomize the exam. Of course, if you're doing Blackboard where they randomize the questions, distractors anyway, that's not something that you can control. And then avoid complex. Y'all have already talked about this. Most items where students only need to know partial knowledge to get the right answer. So if it's all of the above, all they have to do is eliminate one. If it's none of the above, all you have to do is figure out which one might not be correct, and you can figure that out. So this also gets to the A and B, B and C, A and C stuff. So this, again, using distractors that are very specific makes it so that you are not testing their test wiseness. You're testing their knowledge and their understanding. And I'll tell you, I do all of the above sometimes. I catch myself doing that. When you have a lot of things you want to make sure that they can discriminate against, sometimes that is just better for them to maybe do a list or something like that. Is using randomize a better option or one that should be avoided? I think if you're doing it online and you're having it automatically graded, that's totally fine. But you have to be careful when you're doing online exams that the order, because not only are you going to probably randomize the distractors, but you may also be randomizing the questions. And so if it's important that your questions are answered in a certain series, you have to be careful about that. But randomizing the answers, I think, is fine if just when you take the exam, think about that, or when you look through the exam, think about whether those being randomized would impact how students might answer it or not. Keeping the possible answers parallel with respect to length, and this is what Georgina was talking about, form and complexity, where the longest answer typically always is the correct answer. This is one of my questions. So y'all don't know anything about layers of the earth, pretend. Which of these answers is the correct one. You don't even have to read them. Which was the correct one? A, B, C, or D? That's right. It was. So there you go. And then this is another one where there's 2 blanks. That's just a bad question. So that has been rewritten. So yeah, where basically the longest one is the correct one because you've really been specific to make sure that they choose it. Oh, that's so cool. I had forgotten about that. Awesome. And then being grammatically correct, making sure your structure of your question and your subject-verb agreement with your answers is the same. Because that often, if it's not, students will key in and say that was grammatically incorrect. That can't be the right answer. Incorporating common errors into the distractors. This is something I think is really important. Let me talk about this last point. Don't use specific determiners, all or never. Again, in the distractors, we've talked about that. But let me go back to number 9. So common errors into the distractors. This is which of the following statements is false regarding the scientific method? That itself could have been rewritten a little better. But the way that I wrote this question, the way I wrote the distractors and the answer is common misconceptions that students have about what is a hypothesis, what is a theory. And so if they understand the content and the concept, they'll recognize that theories are not the conclusive confirmation. What they are is they're an explanation that's supported by a body of data. So I think that's a really good thing to do to put into your multiple choice questions, because that determination between common errors or common misunderstandings is just another level of cognitive thinking that you want to make sure that students are doing. So questions on any of these rules, what we're going to do is we're going to practice them by looking at example questions to see which rules they are breaking. So what I want y'all to do, and if you're typing, please keep typing, go ahead and pull up your handouts, and one of these, page 2, is the 8 general principles that I just went through. So all of those that we talked about, I have listed here, where you have C1, 2, 3, and 4, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And so what I'm going to have y'all do is you're going to look at each of these questions and figure out which rule was broken. And they all have more than one rule being broken. So there are 6 questions. So are y'all ready? All right. So the first question, if there were a question here, which would be the correct answer? Now, you're answering this based on the broken principles, not the actual answer to the question. Okay, so if there were a question here, which would be the correct answer? What rules have been broken? Okay, H. What else? So H is order them alphabetically, yep. B, so I see B. B is the STEM should present a clear and complete problem. Yeah, I agree with that. STEM clarity. Anything else? There's another one there. C. Which C? So when you do C, say C 1, 2, 3, or 4. You're correct. It's C. It's C something though. C3. That's right. It is C3. So B, C3, and H, y'all are awesome. So B, STEM should be clear and complete. C3, they're not homogeneous. We have 3 of them. So there's 2 ways you can look at it. 3 of them are ended with ED, and also 3 of them have to do with being conquered, while only 1 of them is victorious. So likely the answer would have been victorious, not even knowing what the question is. And then of course H is the alphabetizing of the answer. Yeah, victorious is the outlier, exactly. Okay, question number 2. George Washington died at a young age, was quite successful, was the 3rd president, had 3 daughters. What are the broken principles? A and B, written as a question, yep, should be a clear and complete problem. Yeah, A and B are kind of related, but they also go towards different things as well. So A and B, and then we see C2, the option should be similar in length. Good, absolutely. Anything else? E, Concisely state only one idea. Good. So yes, with A, the question, answer A, he both died at a young age and discounted, killed, successful, had multiple things in an answer. So what is it that you really want to make sure that they know? So you want to make sure that those alternatives or the answer itself has one specific one specific concept to it. So yes, E is good. So y'all said A, B, C2, and E. Awesome. And so this is another example of where I would not worry about alphabetizing because they're long answers. All right, number 3. The leader of a civil revolt is called a what? What are the rules being broken? G, yeah. All of the above. G. So option all of the above. E. Each option should concisely state one idea. Yeah, I think so. I think you could do that because all of the above isn't one. A. So we have the stem should be written as a question. Yep. C4, all options should seem realistic and plausible. Yeah, so when you look at that, C4, and also, let's see, H, order them alphabetically, yes. So C4, a leader of a revolt, would it be an individual? Not really. Would it be an enthusiast? Not really. Would it be a revolution? That's not even a person. So C4 or C3 would all be, would be probably both of these, and students might even not know what an usurper is, or usurper, however you say it. So that's not even plausible for them. So there's several things here. A, C1, grammatically, notice that it's called a usurper, individual, revolution. Some students catch that, some don't. So C1, C3, homogeneous. I would definitely add C4. Did y'all say G? Yeah, all the above, yes. And then alphabetical, H. Okay. A sponge is a an. What are rules are being broken? Definitely F, absolutely. And then A, stem should be written as a question. Yep, exactly. What else? Y'all might not catch this one. So a clear and complete problem. Yep. So stem should be written as a question and a clear and complete problem. Yes. So A and B and F. And there's one more. C4. Realistic and plausible to the uninformed? Possibly, yeah, if they didn't know what those terms were, definitely. But if you're in, invertebrate zoology, you would know what those are. Well, there you go. So Porifera is a sponge. It's the phylum of sponges. So D for the AB, but not, D for the AB, but not, yeah, that's also bad. Those are awful. So the one that I don't think that y'all might get, so you have A and you have B, question, complete problem, C3. So C3 is the homogeneous invertebrate, mollusk, porifera. All of these, you can say that that is not homogeneous, but invertebrate is just a generalized category where mollusk is a class and porifera is a phylum, so there's not consistency there. The other one that I forgot to put in here, and I've, let's see, where did that one go? Let's see, concise. Oh, so it actually is also E, because porifera is also an invertebrate. And invertebrates would also include porifera and mollusks. So this is one of those, if you know your invertebrates, you would recognize that these could all be the same answer if you weren't actually talking about sponges. I hope that's clear. So I should add E to this broken principle. All right, number 5. My next to the favorite question. Dome, Ukraland, Demo. Nepal, Canada, Britain, or United States? What are the broken rules? And this is, what's the word? So the sentence structure, or the question itself is not a language. It's just, what's the word for that I'm trying to think of. It's not a true language. But just by looking at it and the answers, you can still find out which rules are broken. So we have beta saying H. Yep, they're not alphabetical. What else? C3, yeah, homogeneous, exactly. Canada, Britain, United States are all English-speaking native countries. Nepal is not. So basically, Nepal would probably be the answer. Anything you notice about the question that you might say, just even not knowing what the words mean would be bad with the question? Yeah, I agree. I think it would be B, so that you don't have a really clear, specific problem. I don't think a question that is 3 words long is necessarily a good question to ask, essentially. So yeah, we have C3 and F, so I would also add B to that, C3 and H, okay? And then the last one, yeah, what are the broken principles? Again, this is gibberish. But there are some rules broken here. So I see C2, similar in length, exactly. What else? B, so B is the stem, should create, yep, a clear and complete problem. H, alphabetical, yep. What else? So someone said C2, there's another C that was broken here. If you really look at the answers. C1, agree grammatically, possibly, yeah, depending on the gibberish. And C3, yeah, homogeneous, C3. So with C3, they are, B and C are all capitalized. So it looks like those two are separate from A and D that are not capitalized. And then C4 should seem realistic and plausible, aside from it being complete gibberish. You would think that it's possible, depending on what the actual question was. So yeah, C2, C3, H, possibly C1, if we knew our grammar. So y'all are good. Y'all did good. So kind of to summarize, really, you want to make sure that your questions demonstrate students' learning and progress. It is not a guessing game. It is not how good can I take a test? How good am I at taking tests? It's versatile. It tests multiple levels of thinking. It can have different stages of it. I often, even one of the things I do with my exams is not that it helps students, but I think it does help them unconsciously. I ask the questions based on, I have 4 chapters, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The first 3 or 4 questions is from chapter 3. The next 3 or 4 questions is chapter 4, because that's how they probably studied. So that kind of helps them settle into the exam and not feel like they're bouncing back and forth between their memory, basically. High validity addresses what it is you're trying to see what they learned. Basically, did they achieving the learning outcomes that you have? And so, again, lots of qualities to multiple choice questions. I hope that that really helps you to see. Oh, okay. I hope that helped you to see what you can be doing and improving. And Dr. Catropo asked, you had been using examples with 4. There's been education that says optimal number is regarding the optimal number of options to gain knowledge of student understanding. So I think that it depends on what you're asking. I found that often, usually I have 4, and I think that that's just, what we've always been doing. I've started moving to 3 when I want them to be able to discriminate between one that's definitely not true, one that might be true, but one that is true. And then when there are multiple options that I want them to discriminate against, I'll do 5, but not more than 5. I think 5, above 5, that gets into maybe you should have like a matching, or you should have a short answer or a list or something like that whenever you get more than 5. 2, of course, is just basically true false. So I think that 3 is okay. 4, I think, is a reasonable number of discrimination points to discriminate between. Y'all were a great group. It was fun to do that with y'all. Y'all have good test wiseness. It's awesome.